Okay. Yes.
All right, we're okay. So, Tom, I'm going to make you a
Co-host?
co-host here. Here we go.
Okay.
Participants and co-host. Yes.
And Dave, do you have the waiting room enabled?
I don't think so, but
So anybody with the link can join automatically?
yeah, what I can do is pause the recording. Let me do that.
So let me then start. Okay, good afternoon. I hope you are all doing well. This is Ashok Ghosh with the association. On behalf of New Mexico Solar Energy Association, I welcome you to this webinar. This is the first of the series of webinars that we will be having during this year. Today we have Tom Solomon as our speaker. The topic is sustainable economy without fracking. The format that we'll follow for this webinar is, once I introduce the speaker, Tom will make his presentation for about 40 minutes. During this time, we'll keep our audio and video muted. If we have any questions while listening to his talk, I request that you enter your questions in the chat box. After the presentation, Dave Thomas will moderate Q&A session. He will take up chat box questions chronologically. Please limit number of questions to one per member. At the end, if we have more time, we can go over your more questions. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Tom Solomon. So Tom Solomon, he's our board member at the New Mexico Solar Energy Association and co-coordinator of 350.org New Mexico. And he's a retired electrical engineer. During his 34 years career at Intel in semiconductor manufacturing, he led the team which built and ramped their Fab 11X Rio Rancho microprocessor factory in 2001, a $2 billion fab which employed 4,000 people at its peak. He also led the effort to build Intel's first 10 kilowatt solar array in New Mexico in 2008, and a larger 100 kilowatt solar array in 2011. After retirement in 2011, Tom became a full-time activist, fighting global warming to ensure a safe climate for his 3 children. Tom's activities as part of 350NM included making 55 individual presentations to advocate passage of the Energy Transition Act from 2016 to 19, including the 3 interim committees of the New Mexico legislature. With that, I invite Tom to give his presentation.
Thank you, Ashok. Let me get right into it and share my screen. And hopefully you can all see this. Yeah, my name is Tom Solomon, and I've been a kind of a full-time climate activist since 2011 when I retired. You know, one of the things that I have done is try to compile information that I think is pertinent to share. And this is talk that I've started recently to share, covering what it will take to take New Mexico's economy and convert it to a fully sustainable economy without fracking, without the oil and gas industry, which according to climate science needs to really wind down within 10 years. So I'm going to get right into it. The agenda for my talk is here. I'm going to divide it into basically 5 sections, these 5 categories, and I'll cover each one, kind of make an introduction at each section, make the main arguments, and then I'll go through and show you some data and evidence to support my claims. kind of like a prosecuting attorney. So, and we'll wrap up with a call for converting New Mexico with a just transition to a sustainable economy without oil and gas. And the summary is here. The fact is that we are in a climate emergency. Climate science says that we have maybe 10 years left to cut global emissions in half by 2030 if we want to avoid potentially catastrophic and permanent climate impacts. And the time is definitely past due for getting on with it on an emergency basis. Right here in New Mexico, we are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases in the United States, both from carbon emissions from coal plants and also the Permian Basin, where fracking to extract oil and gas is a big industry, and it not only releases it directly because of fracking, but then we burn it all and release those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Fracking as an industry is economically unsustainable, but it is also unsustainable because of its greenhouse gas emissions and its health damage, and because it's economically unsustainable because it's fundamentally propped up by a bunch of loans which will likely never be repaid, which are already bankrupting companies with oil prices falling. And wrapping it up, New Mexico cannot rely on the oil and gas industry. We must plan a just transition to a sustainable economy without it reducing it at least in half over the next 10 years. And a brief overview of climate science. This is a chart from NASA showing continuous levels of warming year after year, decade after decade. 2019 was the second hottest year on record. 2020 is shaping up to be about the same, maybe even a little bit hotter. And it's because of the emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which are currently higher in the atmosphere as a concentration than they were at any time before in human history. As human beings and civilization was developing, we never saw carbon dioxide emissions above 300 parts per million in our atmosphere. And we are today somewhere around 416, 17 parts per million, rising at 2 to 3 parts every year as we dump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the forward projections for the end of the century are absolutely catastrophic, possibly up to as much as 900 parts per million, which would end civilization as we know it. We did reach tremendous agreements in 2015 with the Paris Climate Accords, but even with those agreements, even if all of the current pledges were enacted, we're still on a path to exceed 3 degrees C of global warming, which would be disastrous for life on Earth, leading to as much as 23 feet of sea level rise, swamping all of our coastlines, a 40% drop in grain production, leading to a global food deficit, mostly from drought, and not enough food, leading to famine and war. And that is the future that is ahead of us if we don't take urgent action on global warming and climate change. The impacts of all of this are being felt now in terms of wildfires and heat waves, drought and superstorms and famine in the Middle East, and more wildfires like in California, hurricanes such as Harvey and Irma and Maria, Florence, Michael, etc. Those plus wildfires over the two-year period ending in 2018 caused over $500 billion in economic damage, all directly related to climate change. And it just keeps happening. Here in New Mexico, we're seeing the effects due to warmer summers and shorter winters, and the New Mexico fire season has lengthened by a good 2 months versus what it was 40 years ago. And the Forest Service projects that our pinyon pine forests could see massive die-offs, already suffering massive die-offs. They could disappear through much of the range by the year 2030, just 10 years hence. And of course, the insurance industry ends up paying a lot of these disaster claims, and they track them. And they report that world catastrophes are up by a factor of 4 since 1980, and they are all increasing in categories related to global warming, storms, floods, and drought. The geophysical events like earthquakes and volcanoes are not increasing. 75% of the ice on the North Pole is gone, as measured by satellites and sonar measurements. The lateral extent is about half of what it was in 1979. The thickness is cut by half. You multiply those two together and you got 75% of the ice volume in the North Pole is gone. And the trend is unmistakably downward. Every year it gets worse. And the forecast says we may see the North Pole completely ice-free in the summertime in as little as 15 years from now. And that on the Paris Climate Accords led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to issue this report in 2018 called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C. And the overall conclusion was that if we hope to limit warming to the somewhat barely tolerable level of 1.5 degrees, we have to cut our current level of carbon dioxide emissions, which are now about 42 billion tons a year. We have to cut that in half by 2030. We have to cut it in half again by 2040, and it has to go to zero by 2050. And that has to be our goal as a civilization. Where do those greenhouse gas emissions come from? Primarily, it's carbon dioxide, followed by methane with some other trace gases. And the economic sectors that they come from are primarily transportation and electricity generation, both of them about tied at first place, followed by industry and agriculture and various buildings in the commercial and residential sector. The actions that we need to take to cut these greenhouse gas emissions, these are some of the really biggest and highest leverage ones: closing coal and gas-fired power plants and replacing all of that fossil fuel burning with 100% renewable electricity like solar and wind. And then we have to take that renewable electricity and replace all fossil fuel consumption by electrifying it. And that means transportation and heating and industry. And then transforming agriculture and land use to change to a sustainable food system. That has to be done in a way that is just to the workers and the communities that are affected by this transition. That's what we mean by a just transition. When we talk about electrifying everything we use, these are some examples. I'm talking about our cook stoves and our clothes dryers and all forms of transportation, meaning buses and trains and cars and trucks and shipping transportation, small marine vehicles, etc. And then probably one of the longest ones to convert, but also important, is aircraft travel. And it turns out there are actually electric powered airplanes in the sky right now, so it is not impossible to do. Building the political will to act is what it's going to take to make this emergency transition, and the Yale program on climate communications does this survey every year. This is the results from last November, and they categorize the answers into these 6 categories, from alarm to concerned, all the way down to doubtful and dismissive. And it turns out, because of what we're seeing in the news and in front of our eyes, the percent of Americans that are in the alarmed category is basically triple in the last 6 years, from 11 to 31%. And if you look at it, more than 70% of all Americans are alarmed, concerned, or cautiously concerned about global warming. And the key to make them take action is to educate and activate them with a piece of information like the following, which is that 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. Turns out that only 1 in 5 Americans really understand that fact. And once they believe that and see the data and understand that that consensus exists in the scientists community, then they become all the way over to the alarm section. And so that's a key to taking action in the near future. So that was my intro on climate science. Let's talk about the resource curse. And what do we mean by that? It basically means that contrary to what you might think, resources can actually be an economic curse rather than a blessing. And we see that in many countries around the world. In Africa, for example, Niger, Iraq, Libya, Republic of the Congo, Angola, but also in Venezuela. But it also applies here to our state of New Mexico. And what it means, that also called the paradox of plenty, what it means is that countries that are rich in natural resources perform less well economically than countries that don't have those resources. And here in New Mexico, we see it play out. The fossil fuel industry, the oil and gas industry, extract those resources, which then creates some wealth for them and jobs and taxes paid into our state government. But it also comes with pollution in the air, the water, and the land. The wealth from that extraction and those sales is used for political power. The oil and gas lobby uses it to favor industry with lower taxes and reduce regulation, which we have seen. And in fact, we have here in New Mexico cut income taxes for the top 3% because, hey, the oil and gas industry was providing all this revenue. Why do we need to tax ourselves? And that means that we become even more reliant on that one industry. And in addition to that, we underinvest in the rest of our economy because why do we need to? There's all this jobs and wealth coming from this one industry, and so we don't need to pay attention to developing the rest of our economy, leading to even more reliance on the oil and gas industry, and the cycle continues. That is the resource curse that plays out in our state. And an example of how that plays out politically, this article from March 31st of this year documented the fact that the oil and gas industry donated about $11.5 million to New Mexico political campaigns. And in this state, that's a lot of money. Leading to some people to say that when the roundhouse is in session during the legislative session, there can be more or as many oil and gas industry lobbyists as there are lawmakers. Like we're talking about 90 of them representing more than 60 companies. And for all of that money and all that influence, they get votes and they get legislation and they get filibusters. And we have seen that play out over and over and over again. In addition, in 2003, we really did cut income taxes, and it benefited basically the top 3% of our earners in the state. We cut the top income tax rate by 40%, and we cut the capital gains tax rate by 50%. And in 2003, 17 years ago, that was estimated to cost the state about $360 million a year in tax revenue. But of course, our economy has grown about 65% since then. So if you bump that number up by that factor, that might be costing us $594 million in tax revenue to our state. And anytime tax cuts are proposed, especially for upper income levels, there are always promises of an increase in jobs, but we did not see that, and I'll show you. So the result is we over-rely on the oil and gas industry. We increase their political power. We also cut environmental protections. As an example, the Oil Conservation Division, which is charged with overseeing the pollution regulations for that industry, saw their staff cut by 40 to 60% at the same time when the number of oil and gas permit applications was rising by a factor of 5. And we've underinvested in the rest of our economy. So this is what the job growth picture looked like for the last 30 years. This is from the Federal Reserve Bureau of Labor Statistics. They track this data. And for the state of New Mexico, we were seeing some nice healthy job growth from the 1990s through the early 2000s. And then in 2003, we cut those taxes. And so you could ask the question, did we see an increase in that trend of job growth during that time frame? So if you just take a look at the slope of those jobs increasing year by year, maybe you can say there were about 18,000 jobs added above that trend line during that time frame after the job cuts, or after the tax cuts rather. But the thing is, the rest of the country was seeing that same kind of an effect, increases in jobs because of the housing bubble. And it was not unique to New Mexico. And of course, after the crash, those increased jobs all went away, and it took over a decade for it to reach the level that it was before. So we did not see an increase in jobs in New Mexico as a result of those tax cuts. Let's talk about fracking and the false promise of fracking in the state. Fracking is one of the most damaging ways you can extract fossil fuels, which then get burned, which causes heating of the planet that we're seeing. And of course, I showed you a lot of the destruction that it's causing. But fracking also releases toxins that damage your health, and it is uneconomical. Fracked wells require constant and costly redrilling because of the rapid decline in production from a fracked well, and I'll show you all of that. Turns out, as an industry, fracking lost money even when oil was over $60 a barrel, and it's about $36 a barrel today. So they were just piling up massive amounts of debt. Let me show you all of that. This report from the New England Journal of Medicine from January this year documented the fact that fracking and the natural gas coming from it causes health and environmental hazards at every stage of its life cycle, causes contamination of ground and surface water, it pollutes the air. The gas compressor stations emit toxic and carcinogenic chemicals like benzene and formaldehyde, and a lot of these installations are preferentially positioned next to marginalized communities, so those communities which don't have the political power to push back and prevent that from happening end up bearing the brunt of those environmental injustices. And those health effects include an increased risk of asthma, as well as COPD. So fracking damages your health, well documented that that's the case. Let's just spend a couple of slides explaining what we mean by fracking, just so everybody understands the process. It is not conventional oil drilling. It is specifically unconventional oil and gas production that uses injected high pressure water along with chemicals and sand to hydraulically fracture and shatter layers of rock deep underground, which then allows you to extract oil and gas from the shale rock that's there. And it typically uses horizontal drilling. And the term shale refers simply to basically ancient compressed mud that used to contain, you know, some forms of life, from decayed ferns to little creatures in the swamps, etc. It got compressed into oil and gas over the eons. So that's what shale is. Fracking starts with a single drilling rig on the surface, and you drill a well, you know, thousands of feet down to wherever that shale layer it is. In this example, it's 5,000 feet of the Marcellus Shale. And then the drill rig turns horizontal, and you drill all these laterals, a network of laterals deep underground, paralleling the shale rock. And in this example, there's a network of about 8 wells per square mile, each one here about 5,000 feet long. You know, they might be a few hundred feet wide or dozens of feet wide. And that is what a network of fracked laterals looks like deep underground, but it's not a pool of oil. It's basically rock that you shatter so that you can extract the oil and gas that's embedded in that shale layer. And to get that oil and gas out requires a lot of water. We're talking 2.6 million gallons of water per well, according to the EPA. That water is pumped deep underground, added chemicals, which makes it toxic, and then you extract the oil and gas along with whatever else is in the shale layer, and often it's a lot of radioactivity. And that produced water comes back up out of the ground and has to be disposed of, and that is a big environmental problem. So because you end up with you know, these laterals, these fracked horizontal laterals, you can pump out some amount of oil and gas from each one of them, and the production really lasts in a big way for about 12 months. But over the course of 12 months, the production of oil and gas on an example fracked lateral well drops off by about 70% over the course of 12 months. And this is a chart from the Energy Information Agency looking at production curve for a single Permian well. So because of that rapid decline in production, you're in constant mode of having to drill new wells to replace this fall off in production. Sometimes they call that the Red Queen syndrome from Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen says you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the single place. And each one of these wells, you're looking at about $3 to $6 million to drill each well. So it's a constant amount of spending that you have to keep doing just to keep production at a constant level. So what does that do to the economics of a company that engages in fracking? Well, that was analyzed, among others, by Rystad Energy, one of the most respected oil analysis companies. They're actually based in Norway. And they looked at a group of 40 shale oil companies in the United States and concluded that 90% of US shale oil companies lost money. That was during this time frame from 2014 to 2019 when they did this analysis. And they plotted each quarter how much it cost to drill a well and how much cash they got from production out of that well. And quarter after quarter after quarter, the orange bar is above the green bar, which means that's a loss. They were spending more money to drill new wells than they got from the oil and gas that they sold. That's called a money-losing business, and it means that they're piling up a massive amounts of debt just to stay in business. And this was when the price of oil was over $60 a barrel. Even at that time, they were losing money. So the question is fracking a Ponzi scheme? So a Ponzi scheme is, a fraudulent scheme where you borrow money from new investors to pay off the old investors to think you've got a viable business. And that's essentially the business model of fracking companies. They take out loans every year to cover their cost of drilling, and they use that loan to pay off the loans from 10 years ago that come due in the current year, and they end up with this stack of loan after loan, and the mountain of loan and debt gets higher and higher every year because of that. Since 2010, the fracking industry built up over $200 billion in debt because of that business model. And you can ask yourself, why the heck are they in this business? Well, they are betting that the price of oil is going to go back up, back to where it was in the heydays some years back when the price of oil was $100 a barrel, and you can make money in fracking at that level. But I will show you that the prospect for getting back to high prices of oil over any long period of time is a losing proposition because of the advent of electric vehicles, which use no gasoline. So this is a case study that was done by the largest fracking company in the Permian Basin, Pioneer Resources. And analysts looked at their balance sheet over a period of a decade and said that year after year after year, they were piling up red ink. They only made positive cash flow for 2 out of those 10 years. Basically, they lost, just this one company, $7.9 billion on oil production, increasing their debt load by that period of time. And that is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. Story after story told us that fracking loses money, reported in the Wall Street Journal and NPR and CNN Business and their own Journal of Petroleum Technology. And you can find story after story documenting that. Bankruptcies increased dramatically in 2019. There were 42 bankruptcy filings in this category of companies, oil and production companies for the fossil fuel industry. And just those companies alone ended up with $26 billion in debt. And looking at what that does to the stock price of oil companies, we can pick out ExxonMobil. It's the largest oil company in the world. And during the last 5 years up through the beginning of 2019, beginning of 2020, during those last 5 years, the S&P 500 broad stock market index rose by 58%. But ExxonMobil during that same time, their stock price dropped by 19%. And so it's been a lousy investment, and most people know that. And banks are waking up to the fact that this is a money-losing industry, and they are shutting off the spigot of loans to fracking companies. Another piece of evidence, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas does a survey of oil-producing companies, asking what is the break-even price of oil that they require in order to profitably drill new wells, which is basically a prerequisite for them staying in business and maintaining a constant level of production. And their answer that they got back from the companies themselves was an average of $50 a barrel. That's the price that they need to break even. The range of answers in the Permian Basin got from $23 all the way up to $70, but the average was $50 a barrel. And the price of oil yesterday Friday close, was $36 a barrel, well under 50. And that's a recovery from the 20-some level that it was about a month and a half ago. So they are losing money as an industry. So let's look at their worldwide competitors, like in the Middle East. This is a chart of the break-even cost of production for most of the oil-producing countries around the world. The Middle East alone has 57% of all oil reserves, and they can profitably, or at least they can break even on pumping a barrel of oil at $9 to $20 a barrel. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, $10 a barrel. So the fracking industry cannot compete with conventional oil drilling. And as the price of oil drops, they will be on the losing end. And then who cleans up the abandoned oil wells that they leave behind as massive scars on the landscape? And the answer is you and me. Who are those banks that are loaning money to the fracking industry? Turns out JP Morgan Chase is the number one at $43 billion for the last several years, followed by Wells Fargo, which is a really big bank in the state of New Mexico, and close behind is Bank of America, followed by Citibank. Something to keep in mind when you choose your bank. So that was the end of that section. Now we're going to look into the near future as the growth of electric vehicles really starts to accelerate. And these electric vehicles, of course, don't use gasoline, which comes from refined oil. Peak oil, by which we mean peak oil production, was predicted to happen in 2023 from the Carbon Tracker Institute, or 2025 by McKinsey. There are a lot of people saying currently that it may be happening this year because of the pandemic. Also worth noting is that the peak of production for gasoline cars and trucks actually happened 3 years ago in 2017. Sales growth has basically all shifted to electric vehicles, which use no gas. And that shift to electric vehicles is basically irreversible. And it will cause a permanent continuous decline in global oil demand, because about 63% of all crude oil usage is for transportation of all kinds. In addition to that, responding to the Paris Climate Accords, country after country, city after city around the world are banning or issuing future bans of gasoline and diesel-powered cars. We're talking big cities in Europe, like Frankfurt and Berlin and Stuttgart and Bonn, Madrid, Athens, and Mexico City banning diesels, whole countries like Norway and Sweden, provinces in China, India, the United Kingdom, France, Taiwan, etc. So the future for gasoline and diesel-powered cars is bleak. They need to wind down. Countries are banning their use, and they're going to require electric cars instead. This is a chart from the Motor Vehicle Manufacturing Organization documenting the fact that production actually did peak at 96 million units a year in 2017. It dropped in 2019 down to 91 million a year. It will be far below that in 2020. We don't know yet, but the pandemic is going to drop worldwide vehicle sales very significantly. So vehicle production of those gas-powered vehicles is going down. But globally, electric vehicle sales is growing like gangbusters. And we're talking exponential growth. We're talking over the last 6 years, a compounded annual EV growth rate of 61% per year. And you may not see it quite so much because about half of that growth has been in China, but the United States is also growing quite rapidly, mostly because of Tesla Motors. And that growth just keeps continuing. We're talking exponential growth. It is because electric vehicles are better in almost every way. Let me show you some of that. Major vehicle manufacturers are announcing that their future fleets are going to be all electric. We're talking General Motors and Ford and Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen announcing billions and billions of dollars in investment in building new EVs for their future. And a major factor leading to the growth in electric vehicles has been the dramatic drop in the price of the battery pack. That is the single most expensive component of the electric vehicle that's different from a gas-powered car. And the long-term trend has been a drop in battery costs of 20% per year over the last decade. And that has led to the point where you can now buy an all-electric battery-powered car with a 259-mile range for $27,000. That is the Chevy Bolt. And 259-mile electric range is far above where people get concerned about range anxiety. And this curve that I'm showing you here was put out in 2016 by Tony Siva, forecasting the dramatic drop in the price of an electric vehicle as those batteries keep dropping in price. And we are right on the curve. At $27,000, this electric vehicle is significantly below the $33,000 price for an average internal combustion engine or ICE car in the US. And the forecast is by 2022, we're maybe looking at $22,000 for a 200-mile range EV. And in 2025, maybe $12,000. And at that point in time, nobody in their right mind is going to spend the money on a gasoline-powered car that costs 3 times as much per mile to drive. So this chart I put just to prove to everyone that the price of oil actually does obey the law of supply and demand. I think we've certainly seen that before our eyes in the last few months. But in 2014, when there was a worldwide oil glut of about 2 million barrels a day, or about 2% of oil production, just that 2% oversupply caused the price of oil to drop from $100 a barrel in half to about $50 a barrel. And it happened again earlier this year as people stopped driving and taking planes. The price of oil crashed from the $60 range down to 21, and it's recovered a bit. But, oil obeys the law of supply and demand. So that leads people to ask the question, if electric vehicles are continuing to grow so rapidly and 2 million barrels a day drops the price of oil, surplus of 2 million barrels a day, drops the price of oil in half, when will that happen? Well, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, that runs Business Week, they did that analysis a couple years ago. And their conclusion was, at the current rate of growth for electric vehicles, we would see an oil surplus of about that same 2 million barrels a day, somewhere between 2023 and 2025 at the current rate, meaning massive downward pressure on the price of oil because of overproduction. And that will not stop at that point because electric vehicles will continue to take market share from gasoline cars. If you can buy a 200-mile range car for $1,200, that's what you're going to do. And anybody who's driven an electric car knows what I'm talking about. There's a survey that said that 95% of electric vehicle owners, if they're asked, would you ever buy a gasoline-powered car, they say no. 95% of EV car owners will never go back to a gas car. That's how compelling they are. The current oil production was about 100 million barrels a day, but it dropped by about 20% in the current quarter because of the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic impact, and it has yet to recover anywhere near that. And as a result, oil prices, of course, plunged in the March, April, May timeframe, went down to actually negative prices, but bounced around under $20 a barrel for quite a while. It's recovered a bit as a lot of oil production, oil supply has been taken off the market. And so now it's recovered about $36 a barrel. Cuts in the Permian Basin, like in New Mexico and Texas, have been rampant because of this drop in fuel demand. Half of the announced North American oil cuts in production have come from just 3 companies. Chevron slashed its oil production in the Permian Basin by 20%. And in June, this report just came out yesterday, the count of US oil rigs that are required in order to keep fracking production constant dropped down by 80% from what it was a year ago. And oil rig count is now 199 active oil rigs. It's the lowest number of oil rigs operating in the United States since 2005. And here in New Mexico, I plot this data myself. On the left side of this chart is data from Baker Hughes, which tracks this. And this is the year-by-year oil rig count from 2010 to 2019 in New Mexico. So we were seeing well over 100 rigs, last year. It peaked at 114 rigs in New Mexico, but it is down dramatically. It is down by 50% to 57 rigs operating, and it's basically only continuing in Lee and Eddy County, and it continues to drop in Lee County. 2 more rigs lost last week. So New Mexico cannot rely on the oil industry. Even if the global oil economy recovers, because of the pandemic, the future of oil demand is going to be downward because of the growth in electric vehicles, as well as companies and cities announcing bans on gasoline and diesel-powered cars. Oil prices will stay low as the remaining producers compete to sell their reserves before it's too late. So that leads to a call for New Mexico to convert and have a just transition to a sustainable economy without the oil and gas sector, because it's not going to be there. So when we say a just transition, we mean just for whom? It means that those that are most vulnerable to change will be protected, specifically the workers in those industries and women, the poor, and all oppressed groups. That's what we mean by a just transition in that economy. So our economy is not diversified. The oil gas sector is unsustainable and it has to wind down. Climate science says that it must wind down by 50%, at least in the next 10 years. It may go down faster than that. New Mexico, however, has some real advantages. We got a $25 billion investment in our permanent funds, in the land grant and severance tax permanent funds. Largely, all of that money is invested out of state. We could do a much better job of investing those monies in jobs within our state of New Mexico. And we have abundant world-class renewable energy resources, solar, wind, and geothermal. We got universities and the labs. And if we roll back those tax cuts, we can recover about 40% of the lost oil and gas tax revenue. New Mexico youth made a demand for such a just transition to a sustainable economy last September. This is them delivering that demand to the governor's office. And this is a kind of proof that we do not have a diversified economy. We are one of the worst in the nation. We're actually number 44. Colorado, just to our north, is number 11. And if you compare the New Mexico economy to the Colorado economy, what stands out as a difference is that they have a much more robust manufacturing sector, as well as trade and professional services. They do have an oil and gas industry, but it is not in their top 5 private industries. New Mexico depends much too much on the government and government enterprises and the oil and gas industry. And we can do a better job of redeveloping our economy so it's diversified and sustainable. So if, for example, the oil and gas industry were to completely disappear, what kind of hole would it leave? Well, it's about the oil and gas plus support category, as tracked by the New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions, is about 18,000 total jobs in New Mexico. And in fact, a lot of those jobs are probably from out-of-state workers temporarily locating here in the Permian Basin. So the total of New Mexicans employed is actually lower than that. So 2.2% of all jobs. In terms of the state general fund, 2019 was the largest year that we'd ever seen, $2.7 billion into the state general fund. but a typical year, it was about half of that or less. So those are the kind of the big holes that an oil and gas industry completely gone would leave. How do we replace it? Well, as we said, climate science says that the oil and gas sector has to wind down by 50% at least by 2030 and disappear completely by 2050. I think it'll go a lot faster than that. We need a plan and we need a commitment from our government to grow sectors like solar and wind manufacturing and installations and exports. Legalizing cannabis could provide 11,000 jobs in the state. That's more than half of those 18,000 jobs in the oil and gas sector. We can further develop our outdoor recreation and tourism sectors, as well as sustainable agriculture. We've got a growing film industry from film production. We could redevelop or continue to develop software industry in the state. We've got Spaceport America just really opening up and taking off, so to speak. And we can do a better job of transferring technologies into viable businesses from our labs in the areas of medicine and bioscience. This is what those permanent funds look like. We got about $18 billion in the land grant, $5 billion in the severance tax permanent funds. And this is where a lot of that is invested, right? So we're talking about, general US equities, international equities, real estate funds, almost all of it out of the state of New Mexico. So if we had an investment council in the state that was told to or incentivized to invest a lot more of that money here in our state, we could do a better job of developing jobs and the economy in our own state. So to conclude, the era of fossil fuels is ending. Climate science tells us we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. Oil prices have collapsed with lower gasoline demand, and that, I believe, is just a glimpse of what the future oil industry is going to look like as electric vehicles grow. High-cost fracking can't compete with low-priced Mideast oil, and they will be the last producers in a low-price environment, putting more pressure on the decline of the fracking industry in the state. And we can plan for this future in New Mexico, or we can be blindsided. So I say, let's lead, let's plan for a just transition to a sustainable economy that works for all New Mexicans. And I will lead you with this one last picture to look at. This is what the skies over Los Angeles look like during the midst of their lockdown when people weren't driving their cars. Vastly cleaner skies, cleaner water. This could be our future. It's in our grasp. We know what it looks like, but we can make it happen. So, thank you. That is the end of my talk. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open us up for questions. So Ashok, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So now we will open for our Q&A, and Dave Thomas, so he's going to moderate. So he'll go over the chat box questions and we will go with that. So Dave?
Okay, well, it looks like Athena had our first question, which is, and what is our government going to do if we are reliant on Saudi Arabia and Russian oil?
Well, those countries and the producers there are looking for, customers. And so they are more than happy to sell us oil. I'm not concerned that we're going to be locked out of the worldwide market. And if that were to ever happen, then, that would mean that we'd be incentivized to restart the fracking industry in our own production here, which we shouldn't do. But I'm not concerned that that's a national security problem for us. I'm not sure that anybody else is.
Okay. Looks like Walter Gersel had a question. Can we have a natural gas ETA in New Mexico?
Well, that's an interesting question. The Energy Transition Act does require that at least electricity generation, a lot of which uses natural gas, has to wind down to basically, zero, or has to be all renewable all carbon-free by 2045. So that portion of natural gas usage would be, but natural gas is used, as you point out, Walter, and to heat our water in our homes. It's your hot water heater. It's your gas-powered, furnace to heat your air in the winter. Those can be replaced by electricity, by heat pumps. The technology exists. The prices are coming down. To require that transition to occur would take legislation, and there are some people that are doing that. There are forward-thinking communities. I'm thinking Berkeley and Santa Cruz, California, Seattle, Washington, San Jose, California, that have actually passed ordinances that said that future home construction can't be built with natural gas hookups, that it all has to be electric. And so that'll drive that change. Love to see that happen in our state.
Wow. So Athena also mentioned that we have a teeny ETA, the 2019 ETA, as it affects natural gas and electricity generation. That is more of a comment than a question, I guess.
And Gail asked about making the presentation available. It's in the cloud at that link right there, so anybody can link to it. If NMSEA's webmaster wants to link to it, fine with me.
We can arrange that. That'd be a great idea.
All right. You're welcome, Gail. Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah, if somebody wants to ask a question directly, we could unmute them and.
We could do that, sure.
Athena asks, will it be available on YouTube? We will be able to post it on the web. I think our intern Isaac might start a YouTube channel just for events like this. But I will certainly archive the recording and make that available to Isaac to get in the YouTube or what have you.
Okay. I have presented this a few other times previously, and I did it recently, end of May, and it was live streamed on Facebook, and that recording, that Facebook recording is available, and I can post a link to that if I find it. And I'll put that in the chat as well if people just want to have a place where somebody else can see the recording. I'll do that in a minute.
Okay. Looks like Stephen Kessner had a question. Why is there so much of an obstacle to having a dynamic gas tax, low when oil is expensive and high when oil is cheap? So like a interactive gas tax.
I think we all know the political resistance to any kind of a tax increase. And so that is it in a, there is all new taxes are bad, all new tax increases are bad. That is some people's ideology. On top of that, an increase in the gasoline tax, provides disincentive for further oil production, and the oil industry gets completely up in arms when anything like that is proposed, and they use their political leverage, as evidenced by the $11.5 million they did on oil and gas lobbying in the Roundhouse in the last few years to prevent that from happening. And so far, they have been successful. I personally am in favor of increasing the gas tax. So, yes.
Looks like Walter has another question. Will an all renewable energy portfolio be more expensive than a fossil fuel portfolio?
Good question, Walter. That has been the claim from the opponents of renewable energy for years and years. And 10 years ago, that would have been true. Currently, it is absolutely not true. And you can look up, there's an organization called Lazard. It's a French banking, investment and banking house, and they publish a great report every year showing what is the cost of electricity production by source. You know, what does it cost from a coal plant, a gas plant, a nuclear generating station, solar and wind. And the cheapest sources of new electricity generation by far are onshore wind and photovoltaic solar energy. And so an all renewable portfolio would be cheaper at the current time than a fossil fuel portfolio. Would require some expenditure in a battery backup. I think we still don't have the answers for the last 10% or so to get to 100% renewable energy, but we will get those answers, and there are people working on it. The technologies exist. We just need to make the costs come down. So all renewable energy will be cheaper than what we're currently doing. I also see a question from Lois. What is the severance tax? The severance tax is, the term severance refers to, it's kind of a funny term, but it refers to the act of severing a natural resource from its current home, meaning, you know, underground. So when a company severs a natural resource, takes it from the natural owners of it, which is, you know, all of us as citizens of the state, they pay a tax on that taking or that severing of that resource from us as public owners, and that is what a severance tax is.
Wow.
If you mean what is the amount of the severance tax, Lois, is that what you meant? I might even have that somewhere to back up. So.
No, Tom, that's not what I meant.
Okay. It turns out the severance tax is 3.75%. So.
It's what?
3.75%.
Of what?
Probably of the value of the resource, and I don't know more than that, how they calculate that.
Okay, so in the future that will go down substantially.
The taxes that the oil and gas industry are paying in go down, are already forecasted to drop like in half or more because of the decline of the industry and their production levels, and because of the low price of oil and gas. That is absolutely true. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah. And you know, hence my presentation, because we got a big hole to fill. The legislature will be in special session in just a few days, I think on the 18th of June. And their challenge is to figure out what to do about the state budget in the current environment where the price of oil has dropped so dramatically and the amount of production has dropped so dramatically, more than 50% in the state so far, and continuing to decline.
Okay, looks like we do you have any more question, Dave?
I just wanted to mention, I thought it was a great talk. I really appreciate the part about the fracking, you know, just being essentially a Ponzi scheme. Hadn't thought of it like that. So yeah, I got benefit, learned a lot.
Good. So let me just expand on that. If you remember the slide that I presented from the, you know, the survey that was taken by the Dallas Federal Reserve, what's the price of oil that you need to break even to continue to profitably drill a well, where it was $50 a barrel. There was a range of answers, and some of the answers for some of the most efficient producers go down to $23 a barrel. So it is possible that some, you know, on the tail of that curve, there will be a few producers, and they're probably the biggest oil majors like Exxon and Chevron and Shell, that will be able to continue to produce oil at, at as low as $23 a barrel. They're not making much, if any, money, but maybe they're not going out of business. So that what that means is that the people operating in the sweetest of the sweet spots in the Permian Basin and the Delaware Basin, where the price of oil or the production levels are the highest, will continue to be able to operate for a period of time. But those sweet spots get tapped out over time, and then the price, the production price goes up. So it's not a long-term play, I believe.
Well, I think the other important point was if we get in a wrestling with Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, they're going to win. They got a whole lot more than we do.
They got a whole lot more.
Doesn't cost them near as much.
And that's why they're doing it.
Yeah.
A lot of people saying that the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, one of the desired outcomes on their part was to crater the U.S. shale industry, which has been basically keeping the price of oil low and stealing market share from OPEC and from Russia. And it's having the desired impact.
So this is Lois. I have another question. I see that the link that you posted, Tom, which was, you said, a version of your presentation.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe I had heard earlier that there would be an animated version of the presentation with you speaking, moving your head around and stuff.
Well, there is a recording of me presenting it like I did today.
Okay, and where is
that? That is pending.
Pending.
It's on Facebook, and I will post it shortly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Looks like Dave Fosdick had another question. What about natural gas and the San Juan Basin?
Forgive me while I find this link and post it, and I'm going to do that, and then I'll get to your question.
Multitasking.
Good question. Okay, so there's a, I think May 29th or May 19th or something, live stream of me presenting this. It's essentially the same talk. So what about natural gas? So the reason why these fracking companies drill in the Permian Basin is to get at the oil. That is really what they're after. That's where they make their money. There is so much natural gas available in the United States, especially, that it has driven the price of natural gas down to a point where Chesapeake Energy, one of the biggest natural gas producers, is basically going bankrupt. So the price that these oil producers get for the natural gas that comes up with the oil when they frack is so low that they consider it a nuisance. They consider it a waste product. They would be more than happy to just be able to vent it in the atmosphere or flare it just so that they can continue producing the oil. And the problem with natural gas production is that in order to capture the natural gas, you need a pipeline. You need a natural gas pipeline to every one of those wells, one of those wellheads, in order to, pipe it off to where it can be used. And that means infrastructure in pipeline production for every new one of these fracked wells that they create. And it slows them down and they don't like it. And it leads to this problem that we have where there's massive amounts of methane being either flared, which means they're burning it, or just leaked or vented, which means it's going into the atmosphere as methane, which is 80 to 86 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. So it's a problem. the New Mexico Environmental Department and the Oil Conservation Division are proposing new rules and putting in rules in place that say they're not going to allow new permits to be approved for an oil well until they have a plan to capture and not vent or flare the natural gas that comes along with it. But they have not been operating in that way up until now. Hope that was an answer.
Very good. Stephen Kessner had another question. Might the low price of oil and low gasoline taxes slow electric car growth and delay the trends you outlined?
Possibly. That theory has been proposed. There are so many reasons why electric vehicles are cheaper. It turns out that in order to drive a mile in a gas-powered car, let's see, when the price of gas was about $2.20 a gallon, I did this calculation. To drive a mile electric was still 1/3 to 1/4 less than it was to drive that same mile powered by gasoline, because electricity is just so cheap, and because electric vehicles are vastly more efficient in the use of electricity to drive the mass of the car forward than a gas engine. So the price of a gallon of gasoline would have to drop down to, we'd have to be probably sub 80 cents a gallon of gas in order for it to be price parity with the price to drive an electric vehicle. But there are so many other benefits for driving an electric car versus just the price to go a mile. They are vastly safer. They are much, much faster and higher performance. Anybody who's driven an electric car is amazed at the amount of acceleration that is available instantly, instant torque out of an electric motor. There is no poisonous pollution that comes out of the rear end of your tailpipe. The skies are cleaner. The benefits just go on and on and on. The amount of maintenance cost for an electric vehicle is like 1/10 that of a gasoline powered car, because there's one moving part in the engine, the rotor in the electric motor. So I don't think it would slow it down substantially, the low price of oil. Good question, though.
Excellent.
I think it's time to say that we would like to close it.
Well, let's have one more question from, looks like Dave Fosdick from up in Farmington. Has any comments on Enchant CC retrofit scheme to the SJGS?
Sure. Yeah, that's Enchant Energy's proposal to take the retiring San Juan generating station and retrofit it to carbon capture and sequestration, which is a misnomer, because they would just use the carbon for basically freeing up more oil. I think it's a pipe dream. I think it's a silly, crazy, economically not viable at all proposal that is just fooling the people in Farmington that there is some possible way to keep that plant open and those jobs operating. Carbon capture is a technology by which, you put on some additional, processing units to capture the carbon dioxide and pollution that comes out of the stack from burning coal, and you find a way to sequester it underground in some place else. By its very nature, it robs a lot of efficiency from the power plant. It makes it much more expensive to operate. It's, I think, anywhere from 30% of the efficiency of the power plant is robbed by adding the carbon capture technology. There are basically, there's maybe one carbon capture sequestration operating plant in the world, and nowhere near like what they're proposing to do for San Juan. San Juan is a generating station, is a plant that was built in the 1970s. We're talking, 40 plus, almost 50 years ago. And you're taking an aging, broken down power plant and wanting to retrofit it with massive investments of hundreds of millions of dollars of new technology that makes it less efficient. And it's just stupid. So it is, if we end up re-electing the current president, it's possible that they may get so much money from the federal government that they can make it happen. It's another reason why you might want to consider that when you vote. But I think it's got nowhere to go. I think it's stupid and won't happen.
Alrighty. Well said, Tom. Well, I think we're about ready to bring it to a close. So it looks like we do have a YouTube channel. So I'll work with you to get this video uploaded to that. That'll be something to look forward to.
Okay.
And we'll send the links to everybody. But I also like to thank you, Tom. Let us give a big hand to Tom.
Thank you.
You betcha. Here we go.
We are also looking for speakers. If you know anybody who fits into our this society or association's expertise, if you please let me know, and we'd like to in our future speaker series, we'd like to consider them. So with that, I think we will we'll conclude here.
Very good. Thank you for your attention. I enjoyed doing the presentation. Good question.
Very good.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.